Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen. Chapter 1. Rome, 1946. The city was quiet. It had been unusually warm for September, and the night air still held much of the heat of the day. So the citizens of Rome slept with their windows open. In the Piazza Santo Stefano, where it was a little cooler, Carlo Ricci leaned against the doorframe of his cafe. At this hour, he should have long been in his bed. But one table remained. 3 Americans lingered. One was a sailor. Carlo wasn't entirely sure if the other 2 were soldiers or airmen. He suspected the quantity of wine they had consumed made them oblivious to the hour. Then again, they were Americans who acted like they owned the world. So he thought,
who knows?
Now, he surveyed the familiar contours of the piazza that had been home to his cafe for more than 20 years. When he first opened the cafe, Mussolini had been prime minister for only a few years. How could anyone have foreseen the madness that would swallow Italy, Europe, and the whole world? For Carlo, the madness ended when the Americans liberated Rome in June of 1944. For the rest of the world, it took another year to end it all. When the Americans came, they were at war, forcing the Germans out of Italy. Now, more than 2 years later, they were part of the Allied occupation force. The Americans had been joined by several other countries in the occupation, including the British. But it was the Americans who had the money. Carlo saw it every day in his cafe. Their casual spending and their seemingly endless supply of cigarettes and chocolate. The other Allied forces might share the occupation duties, but the Americans were the ones keeping Rome's economy alive. Things were good, and the Americans were, for better or ill, still here. It had rained earlier, and Carlo had hoped it would cool the air. Instead, it left the night heavy and stifling. The square lay dark, silent, and wet, bathed in the soft glow of a single street lamp. Before the war, it would have been alive with light, even at this ungodly hour. Now, the light only just pierced the darkness. The war had changed everything. There was his boy, Marco. No, not a boy anymore, now a man who had served in Greece. Carlo's chest tightened at the memory of those anxious days, waiting for news. But Marco had returned, changed perhaps, but whole and alive. It changed his sister Lucia. Carlo's mind conjured images of the fierce bombardment near Monte Cassino. She had lived in Cervaro and had seen it completely destroyed in the fighting. Carlo had been certain he'd lost her. Yet somehow, she'd survived those hellish days, emerging from the rubble with a strength that left him in awe.
Che Dio ci protegga.
Carlo said, crossing himself.
May God protect us.
The weight of their survival weighed on his heart, a blend of joy and lingering disbelief. He paused by a table, absently straightening a chair. The simple act grounded him, reminding him of the present and of the future that life had granted them. Carlo's memories were interrupted by the American sailor leaning too far back in his chair and falling over, taking a nearby table with him. The loud clanging of iron on stone echoed through the piazza as his buddies laughed and eventually helped him up. One of the other 2 looked at Carlo in embarrassment. Carlo responded with a shrug and a smile.
Americans,
he thought. He returned to his reverie.
We made it,
he said, whispering in Italian to no one.
all of us.
Carlo's eyes misted as he remembered those less fortunate. Neighbors who had lost children, friends who had never returned. The guilt of his family's survival mingled with his relief, a bittersweet cocktail he had grown accustomed to. A screeching cat drew Carlo's attention. His eyes swept across the dimly lit piazza. He checked the trio of American soldiers again. It was after 1 a.m., but they showed no signs of departing, their raucous laughter and clinking glasses indicating they were deep in their cups. They had run up a large bill, and the Americans, he had learned over the last 2 years, were generous tippers. So there was that. He shook his head as a wry smile appeared. Patience had become a virtue over the years of running his cafe. Rome moved at its own unhurried pace, and Carlo had lived his entire life in the languid rhythms that defined the eternal city. Stepping back inside, he continued to clean, his movements deft and efficient after years of repetition. As he worked, his gaze would occasionally drift through the open door and back to the Yanks, taking in the animated gestures and boisterous exchanges between the young men. Despite their rowdiness, Carlo felt no real irritation, only a deep sense of contentment. These were the moments he cherished, his cafe filled with life, strangers, brought together by the simple pleasures of good food, good wine, and good company. It was a reminder of why he did what he did, day in and day out. A short time later, a sudden burst of laughter and the noise of chairs scraping the cobblestones drew his attention. Glancing out the door, he watched the Americans stumbling to their feet, their movements exaggerated and unsteady. As the 3 Americans made their way across the piazza, one of them turned back, catching Carlo's eye. With a wide, lopsided grin, he raised his hand in an exaggerated salute, his buddies joining in with enthusiastic whoops and hollers.
Good night!
Good night. Arrivederci, signor.
You can bet on seeing us here again.
Carlo
tomorrow night.
returned the gesture warmly, his face creasing into a broad smile. A soft chuckle escaped his lips as their unsteady figures swayed into the distance, their voices carrying on the calm night air. One of the Americans, perhaps a little homesick, began singing a song about coming home from war to their wives and sweethearts and everything they miss.
I'm coming home. I'm far away and I miss you so. You're on your mama's porch, I know. It was the 4th and our hearts were bright as fireworks.
Carlo turned his attention back to the table they had occupied.
When I'm home,
To his delight, a crisp $5 bill lay amidst the scattered glasses and crumpled napkins.
always in my heart.
True to form, these Americans were good tippers.
Keep on singing, I'm coming home.
Soon, the Americans' singing faded, and the silence of the night settled over Piazza Santo Stefano once more. The only sounds punctuating the stillness in the piazza were the sounds of Carlo tidying up. Then, a piercing scream shattered the quiet like a brick through a window. The primal cry, laced with desperation and pain, echoed through the piazza, sending a shock through Carlo. He froze. The plate he had been holding clattered to the ground and broke into pieces. He whipped his head around and strained to pinpoint the source of that awful sound. Another scream, this one even more anguished than the last. Reverberated through the narrow streets and off the old buildings. Carlo's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes darted frantically, searching for any sign of distress. The screams seemed to come from all directions at once. The acoustics of the stone structures distorting and amplifying the haunting wail. Nearby, in a third-floor apartment, Maria Albano was fighting for her life. Her screams erupted from deep within, bursting from her mouth and spilling out the open windows. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from her attacker, her eyes wide with terror. The dim light of her apartment cast eerie shadows across the room, distorting her assailant's silhouette into something monstrous.
Ti prego.
She said in a trembling gasp. The figure advanced, silent and implacable. A sword glinted wickedly, already stained with Maria's blood. She raised her arms, the black lace of her corset in stark contrast to her pale skin, now streaked with red. The sword flashed, and pain erupted across her forearms. She stumbled backward, her back hitting a wall with a dull thud. Terrified, she cried out.
Santo Dio.
She screamed, the cries for help tearing from her throat.
Aiuto! Qualcuno mi aiuti!
The sword missed its mark twice. The first swing scraped plaster off the wall, and the second shattered a mirror above the mantel, sending tiny shards flying across the room. The sword struck again and again, finding its mark. Blood splattered across the white walls, floors, and the killer's coat. It was an abstract in red of murder. Maria's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall, leaving a crimson smear in her wake. Her vision blurred, and the room spun around her. Still, she fought, her hands weakly flailing at her assailant.
Dio santo!
Her words became a mantra, a desperate prayer spilling from her lips as her voice turned raspy.
Dio santo! Dio santo!
Her calls to God went unanswered. The sword rose and fell, relentless. Maria's screams faded, and her struggles grew feeble. The pain, once sharp and biting, began to dull, replaced by a creeping coldness that spread through her limbs. Her last coherent thought was of the sun-drenched streets of her childhood home and the warmth of her mother's embrace. Then, darkness claimed her, and Maria Albano knew no more. Just 100 meters away, Carlo Ricci heard the piercing screams and the dreaded silence that followed. Panic rose in his body as he searched the night for an answer. What to do? How to respond? How to combat the dread he felt? But the darkness offered no comfort, no solution. Sweat broke on his forehead, a cold dampness that made him shiver despite the warm evening. Without realizing it, he found himself biting the first knuckle of his right hand, an old, nervous habit he thought he'd long outgrown. It was as if he were a child again, hiding under the stares from his angry father. Enough. Time to act. He turned abruptly, stumbling in his haste, and walked back into his cafe. With trembling steps, he made his way to the front counter. His hand hung over the telephone for a moment before he picked it up, the black plastic receiver cool against his clammy palm. As he listened to the dial tone, Carlo took a deep breath and called for help. Chapter 2. 2 hours later, the narrow street outside Maria Albano's apartment churned with activity. Official vehicles clogged the roadway, their flashing lights silently painting the buildings and the wet cobblestones in an eerie red glow. Captain Dan Kelly arrived in his military-issue Jeep, bringing it to a stop 40 meters from the scene. He could get no closer. Dan stepped out of the Jeep, his boots hitting the cobblestone street with a solid thud. The sound was eclipsed by a deep rumble in the heavens, promising more rain. Dan's cap sat low, shading his dark eyes as they scanned Via della Pace. His broad shoulders filled out the jacket, hinting at the strength beneath the fabric. His uniform, meticulously pressed and maintained, spoke to his character and his attention to detail. The creases in his trousers were razor sharp and his shirt tightly tucked. The collar of his shirt stood at attention, framing his square jaw and the determined set of his mouth. The two silver captain's bars on his uniform caught the flickering lights, a reminder of his duty and the weight of responsibility he carried. As he moved through the crowd, he caught glimpses of friendly faces. Some of the Italian police officers gave him nods of recognition, their eyes conveying a shared understanding of the night's sober purpose.
Captain Kelly,
Said one of them in decent English as Dan passed. Dan returned the nod, his jaw clenched tight. The air was crackling with the acrid smell of fear. He pushed on, his mind racing with dark thoughts of murder. As he neared the apartment building, he was checked by two American military police wearing slickers. The MPs offered rigid salutes. Dan returned them mechanically, his focus already on the apartment upstairs. 40 minutes earlier, Mike Fiorante had woken him with a phone call. The Carabinieri had called because a serious crime, likely involving Americans, had just happened. Mike's call had been short and to the point. He provided details about the victim, Maria Albano, her profession, prostitute, the address, and that it was almost certain her killer was an American. He also told Dan it was a particularly brutal murder and that he should brace himself. On the drive over, Dan thought this last comment unusual, as both men had fought at Monte Cassino. What could possibly be worse than that? Dan ascended the worn tile steps, each footfall echoing in the narrow stairwell. The air grew warmer as he climbed, full of the stench of death and something far uglier. He reached the third-floor landing and stopped. Lieutenant Mike Fiorante, Dan's assistant, interpreter, and former comrade in arms, stood upright, his appearance immaculate despite the late hour. Beside Mike was Captain Formato of the Carabinieri. His weary eyes met Dan's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. But it was the other three figures that caught Dan's attention. The first was a woman about 45, in her housecoat and slippers. She was busy wringing her hands and had dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a harrowing night. Next to her stood her husband. The third was a middle-aged man with a receding hairline. Tied around his waist was an apron stained with what looked to be tomato sauce. Mike raised his hand, and the distressed woman stopped talking. He stepped forward.
Dan, this is Angela Gallo, and this is Carlo Ricci. Both called the police.
Dan looked at Ricci and then turned his attention to Angela, a neighbor of the victim. Mike spoke first. He turned to Angela and in Italian said,
Please tell us what you saw from the beginning.
Angela took a breath, but before she could utter a word, a young American soldier, his face ashen, stumbled out of the victim's apartment. He made it 3 steps before doubling over, retching violently onto the landing. The reek of vomit filled the air, mingling with the already oppressive atmosphere. Dan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain composed. He exchanged a wary look with Mike, both men knowing that only something truly horrible could provoke such a reaction from a seasoned soldier. Angela backed herself against the wall, her eyes wide with renewed apprehension. Captain Formato moved swiftly, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and offering it to the soldier, who was now wiping his mouth with a shaking hand. Mike turned back to Angela. Soon, she began her tale as Mike interpreted. Dan listened intently as Angela recounted her story, quavering with emotion.
Sì, va bene. Maria era una buona vicina, pure se faceva quel mestiere là, però è sempre stata gentile.
stopping as her eyes searched for the right words. He waited on Mike's translation.
She says Maria was a good neighbor, you know, even with her profession.
Angela continued, rubbing her hands together as Mike spoke.
Ieri ci siamo scambiate due parole. Gliel'ho detto che il figo mio va all'università. Lei s'è fatta una risata. Era contenta.
Just yesterday, they had a quick chat. Angela told Maria her son's going off to the university. She says Maria was real happy for him.
Dan listened to Mike while offering looks of encouragement to the overwrought woman.
Stanotte mio marito m'ha svegliata. Senti, m'ha detto.
Then tonight, her husband shakes her awake.
Dan smiled curtly at the man, also in his housecoat, standing nearby.
They hear noises coming from Maria's place. Sounded like a fight. Lot of shouting.
Ste cose succedevano con i tedeschi. Verso la fine, pure spesso. Ma da quando...
Says it happens sometimes when the Germans were still here. Near the end, more often. But since the Americans showed up, nothing.
She paused, her eyes distant, reliving the moment. Dan waited patiently, knowing the importance of letting witnesses speak at their own pace. Dan's attention was drawn when Angela said 2 words in English.
Point. Se so sentite parole in inglese, le capisco pure io, certe. No. Never.
Mike apparently asked her to repeat the words, and she said, no and never again. As she said them the second time, she looked at her husband, who indicated his agreement. Then Mike relayed her words.
She don't speak much English. But her and her husband, they recognized some words. No and never.
Ask her if the person arguing with Maria was an American or an Englishman, he said to Mike. Dan listened while Mike posed his question. Angela and her husband talked with each other, agreeing on an answer almost instantly. She looked at Dan directly and said firmly,
Americano sicuro. Sempre americani.
Always Americans.
Mike said. As Angela went on in Italian, her voice cracked, and she spoke through tears. She finished her tale, crossed herself, and then gave a slight bow to mark her ending.
And then, she says, the screamin' starts. Nothing like she ever heard before. It was bad. Like a cry straight out of hell.
Compassion washed over Dan. Lacking the words, he just shook his head. He glanced at Mike, who was stone-faced. Ask her, how long did the fight last? Moments later, after an excited exchange in Italian, Mike replied,
She's not sure. It felt like a long time, but it must have been only a minute or 2. And then she says, it just stopped. She's scared out of her mind, but they get out of bed. She can't find her house coat. They open the door, step out into the hall, and then she sees somebody bolting down the stairs.
Mike said, interpreting Angela. Dan moved nearer, his interest clear. Before he could ask his next question, Mike was talking to Angela. Angela thought for a moment before she answered.
Era buio, ma ho visto un cappotto lungo, grigio, e in cappello, grosso, con una tesa larga, correa forte.
A minute later, Mike spoke for her.
It's dark, but she sees a guy in a long gray raincoat and a hat, a big brimmed one. She says he moved so fast, it was like he flew down the stairs.
Angela continued to speak. At one point, she took a half step back and then gestured to Mike.
Credo. Era alto come te. Sarà stato 1,70 m, ma non lo so preciso.
She says she thinks the guy was about my size, around 5'10", but she ain't sure.
Ask her if she saw anything else. Anything to identify the killer. As Mike spoke, Angela shook her head.
No, it all happened too fast. She's sorry. Says she wishes she could tell us more.
Mike said on behalf of Angela. Dan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've been very helpful, Signora Gallo. Grazie. He offered her a warm smile. She did the same and moved into the arms of her husband. Dan turned to the man in the apron. Mr. Ricci? Carlo Ricci gave Dan a slight smile and said,
Yes, officer.
Dan, relieved that the man's English was better than his Italian, said, What can you tell us? He spoke in good English as if he had rehearsed what he had to say.
I own a cafe in the piazza nearby.
He pointed over Dan's right shoulder. Then he recounted in detail the late night at his cafe, the 3 Americans, and the screams from beyond this world. He ended with,
The poor woman. The poor woman.
Dan and Mike thanked the 2 witnesses. As they turned toward the victim's apartment, lightning exploded across the sky. Its brilliant flash transforming the landing into stark daylight for one terrible instant. The burst illuminated every corner of the stairwell, through the windows and the open door to the murder scene. Thunder followed immediately, so sudden and violent it rattled the building's ancient bones. Then the sky split open with an almost biblical fury, unleashing a torrent of rain that drummed against the roof. Water cascaded down the exterior walls in sheets. Inside the apartment, Dan's senses were overwhelmed by the desperate scene before him. The small living room teemed with Italian police and MPs. They spoke in low tones, in 2 languages, as they moved about with quiet purpose. As he stepped into the living room, Dan's breath caught in his throat. It was a chamber of horrors, the likes of which he hadn't seen since the war. A young woman lay dead and bloody. She had been hacked to death. Blood spattered every surface, transforming the once cozy room into a scene of horror. The metallic scent hung in the air. His eyes were drawn inexorably to Maria's body, lying face up on the floor, her limbs splayed at unnatural angles, her once vibrant form now still and lifeless. Her arms and upper body were streaked with the evidence of many cuts. They had bled only a short time, for soon after the cuts were made, the victim's heart stopped its work. If we find the killer, he'll be covered in blood, Dan murmured, half to himself. Dan forced himself to look at the victim's face, searching vacant eyes he had seen so many times and hoped he would not see again. They stared unseeing at the ceiling. She was beautiful, even in death. Raven black hair, pale skin, deep brown eyes, thick black eyebrows, and fiery red lipstick. The spark of life that had animated her just hours ago was gone, leaving behind only an empty shell. He swallowed hard, steeling himself. Dan searched the room, taking in every detail. In one corner stood a floor lamp. Its shade had been removed, and the room was illuminated by a single bare bulb. As he moved carefully around the perimeter, shattered glass crunched under his boots, unavoidable in such a small space. The mirror above the small mantel had been smashed, its fragments scattered across the floor like razor-sharp confetti. An overturned chair, one leg broken off and stained with blood, lay near Maria's body.
No sign of forced entry. She either knew the guy or she was expecting somebody. Come on, 1:30 in the morning? You don't just open your door.
Dan agreed, his eyes still searching the room.
Killer's probably an American. Nobody else could pay her price.
To Dan's questioning face, Mike responded,
By all accounts, she earned every penny.
Dan's eye fell on a collection of objects displayed on a nearby dresser. An expensive pendant watch, a gold cigarette case, and an ornate table clock glittered in the harsh light. Each item told a story of Maria's clients, a measure of her allure and the depths of their pockets. Mike continued, with respect and pity.
Story goes, back when she was a teenager, Maria started out on the street, local guys. Then when the war came, she moved up. Italian officers, some say even guys close to Mussolini. When the Nazis rolled in, she adapted, did really well. Now, it's our boys. Brits can't pay what she was paid.
Dan's eyes drifted to a corner of the room where an ornate Nazi sword lay discarded, its blade stained dark with blood. Mike's eyes followed Dan's.
This whole room full of souvenirs from her, customers. But that sword, that's what got her. That's the kind of thing they loved in the High Command and the SS.
Dan knelt beside the weapon, doing his best not to disturb the scene. The craftsmanship was exquisite. The hilt was adorned with intricate engravings and a gold and black swastika. It was a dim reminder of the recent history that still lingered in this city, now made a little darker by its role in Maria's brutal end. Dan's eyes narrowed as he spotted something clutched in Maria's hand. It was a button, unremarkable save for the dark stain that clung to its surface. As Dan pointed to the button, one of the Italian officers slid a small open envelope under it and sealed it shut. As he stood, Dan looked at Maria's face once more. Despite the ugly scene surrounding her, there was an odd serenity to her expression. Mike laid out the murder scene.
When the attack started, they moved around the room until Maria's back was to the wall next to the mantel.
He pointed to a broad blood smear on the wall.
She slid down. There.
Dan could see what Mike was describing.
Then the killer dragged her. Here. Middle of the room. Went at her again with the sword.
The room seemed to close in on them as they pieced together Maria's final moments. Dan's eyes scanned the floor, taking in every detail of the gruesome scene. He'd been a policeman before the war. He came from a town in California. There were no murders there. There hadn't been one in Redstone for 25 years. Nothing in that life had prepared him for this. But the same was true for just about everything that happened to him since he landed in Sicily 3 years ago. Mike pointed to a series of deep gouges in the carpet of Maria's living room, evidence that Maria had fought for her life by knocking some strikes off target.
She fought, too.
He said as he shook his head.
No use against that sword.
Dan murmured his assent, his attention fixed on the bloody trail leading from Maria's body. He could almost see her final moments. Her desperate attempts to escape, her panic as she realized she was outmatched by her attacker. Mike's face tightened as he reached for a bloody cloth covering Maria's abdomen. Dan tensed, bracing himself for what was to come. With a gentle motion, Mike pulled back the fabric, revealing a sight that made Dan's blood run cold. A gaping hand-sized hole marred Maria's stomach, the edges ragged and torn. A large piece of her lower abdomen was gone. Bile rose in Dan's throat, understanding now why the young soldier had lost his supper. Mike spoke in a mere whisper.
The killer? He cut her open and took something. What? I don't know.
Dan stared at the gruesome wound. He'd seen more than his share of broken bodies during the war. But this was different. Artillery does awful harm to bodies, tearing them apart as if they were tossed at a propeller. This was different. Deliberate and by hand, face to face. This wasn't just murder. It was butchery. Dan surveyed the room again, seeing it with new eyes. The blood spatter, the overturned furniture, Maria's final desperate struggle. It all painted a picture of awful suffering. What kind of monster could do this? What twisted mind could conceive of such an act, let alone carry it out? He tried to make sense of the senseless, to understand the incomprehensible, as he crouched over Maria's body, surrounded by evidence of such brutality. What could cause someone to do this? Dan muttered under his breath.
It's a miracle we're not all crazy.
Mike, who was close enough to hear, understood Dan's words completely. Mike's eyes, usually sharp and alert, now held a haunted look that Dan recognized all too well. It was the same look he saw in the mirror some mornings, when the memories of the war crept into his dreams and left him gasping for air.
Sometimes I wonder if we're just better at hiding it.
Mike said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the others in the room. Dan glanced at his friend, noting the tightness around his eyes, and feeling a slight, now routine, tremor in his own hands. He wanted to offer some words of support, but what could he say? They'd both seen too much, done too much. The war left its mark on them as well. Instead, he placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. It was a gesture that spoke of the bond between them, an acknowledgement of shared pain, of understanding that went beyond words. Mike took a deep breath, visibly pulling himself together. When he spoke again, he was steady.
Right now, we gotta focus. This guy we both know. He's one of ours, Dad, an American. What are we gonna do about that?
We do our job,
Dan said firmly.
We find this sad bastard and bring him to justice. American or not, one of ours or not, he'll have to pay for this.
Dan believed that their killer was most likely an American in the services. These men were family to him. He'd lived with them, fought with them, and he had watched many of them die. Now, he was going to bring one to justice. Dan's right hand began to tremble, his professional detachment breaking down in the face of such depravity. He took his next breaths deliberately to calm himself. He couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not now. For now, he had a job to do. There was a killer to catch, and a victim who deserved justice. Chapter 3. Day 1, Redstone, California, 1950. George Ramirez, owner and editor of the Redstone Record, hunched over his Remington Rand typewriter. His fingers danced across the keys with deft precision as he worked on his editorial. The early morning sunlight filtered through the old windows of his office at the Record, casting a golden glow across the organized chaos of his workspace. Scattered papers, dog-eared books, and half-empty coffee cups formed a familiar landscape around him. Each item a marker of countless late nights and early mornings spent crafting the words that would shape the town's narrative. The rhythmic clacking of the typewriter keys filled the air, punctuated only by the occasional pause as George sat back, his forehead wrinkled in concentration. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair before stroking his bushy mustache, a habit as ingrained as typing itself. With a nimble motion, he turned the page up from the typewriter, rotating the platen with a satisfying click, click, click. Scrunching his face, he read aloud, his slight Mexican accent lending a musical quality to the words.
Here in Redstone, we found an oasis. While folks in the Northeast and Midwest will soon have to brace for another tough winter, we enjoy the steady warmth of Orange County's endless summer, just like we always have. Beyond the charm of our town lies a patchwork of green farms and fragrant orchards stretching to the horizon. The sweet scent of orange blossoms in the spring lingers even now, so different from the exhaust-filled streets of Los Angeles, just an hour away.
George, a small smile on his face, was satisfied with the opening, but knew there was more to be said. He turned the page back down into his typewriter, his fingers hovering over the keys as he gathered his thoughts. His eyes wandered through the glass pane, absorbing the view of Main Street stretching beneath him. A young couple, lost in each other's eyes, meandered past, pausing to admire the whimsical display in Miller's Toys' front window. Old Man Jenkins, a fixture of Redstone as constant as the red cliffs themselves, shuffled by with his ever-present cane, pausing to tip his hat to Mrs. Fournier, lost in her daily ritual of sweeping the sidewalk in front of her flower shop. George leaned back, the springs of his chair creaking feebly as he rubbed his mustache, contemplating his next words. The typewriter sprang back to life under his skilled hands.
Life here has its own rhythm. While big city residents rush through their days at a dizzying pace, we've discovered the secret to true happiness. In Redstone, we don't just go through the motions. We treasure every moment, from that first sip of coffee at Kate's Diner to the sound of waves crashing into our crimson cliffs at sunset.
He paused, reading over the words, tasting them on his tongue. Yes, that captured it. The contrast of Redstone's pastoral serenity against the frenetic energy of the nearby metropolis. But there was more to say, more depths to plumb. George's fingers returned to the keys, coaxing forth the words that would paint a vivid picture of his beloved town.
The Pacific Ocean keeps watch over the town, its waves beating steady as a drum against those magnificent red cliffs, the same ones that gave Redstone its name. Over the centuries, those waves have shaped the cliffs, reminding us that time changes everything. But on this golden September day in 1950, it feels like some things, like the heart of our town, might just last forever.
George's fingers floated over the keys as he contemplated his ending. He wanted to capture the essence of Redstone, to distill its spirit into words that would resonate with every reader. After a moment's reflection, he began to type.
In Redstone, we found more than a home. We found a place where the American dream is alive. It's in every smile, every helping hand, and the deep connections we share with one another. We may not have the bright lights of the big city, but we have something far better. A true sense of community and the joy of living life the way it was meant to be.
"2 miles away, Dan Kelly squinted against the morning light as he lined up his shot on the 7th hole of Seven Palms Golf Course. The pristine fairway stretched before him, a velvet green carpet inviting his ball forward. He adjusted his stance, took a deep breath, and swung. The ball soared through the air, slicing to the right before landing with a soft thud just off the green. Dan allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction.
"Not bad, my friend,"
said Father Ted. Through narrowed eyes, Dan studied Father Ted's methodical approach to his own shot. His cassock swapped for a pair of neatly pressed slacks and a polo shirt. The priest's blonde hair caught the light, giving him an almost angelic glow. With a fluid motion that seemed impossible given his large frame, Father Ted swung his club. The ball arced gracefully through the air, landed like a gentle kiss on the green, and rolled to within feet of the hole.
"Now that's what I call divine intervention."
A laugh drifting across the course. Dan shook his head. After 4 years of knowing Father Ted, his zest for life still amazed him. The priest moved with a slight limp, a remnant of his time as a chaplain during the war. But it did nothing to dampen his spirits. As they walked toward the green, Father Ted's expressive hands punctuated his speech. His soft Polish accent added a soothing quality to his words, his deep, reassuring voice carrying easily across the well-groomed fairway.
"You know, Dan,"
Father Ted said, pausing to wipe his neck with a handkerchief,
"golf is a lot like life. Sometimes you're in the rough, sometimes you're on the green, but it's how you play through that matters."
Dan grinned, noting the way Father Ted's round face lit up when he spoke. It was easy to see why the priest was so beloved in Redstone. His warm smile and twinkling eyes invited trust, making him a natural confidant for the town's residents. As they approached the green, Dan eyed Father Ted's shot with disbelief.
How the hell do you do that?
The priest's face broke into a wide smile.
"Perhaps the Lord guides my hand."
Or perhaps you've made a deal with the other guy.
Dan retorted, earning a mock scandalized gasp from his friend. As they stood on the green, Dan couldn't help but marvel at the sprawling beauty of the course. The manicured grass, dotted with palm trees and sand traps, seemed to go on forever under the clear California sky.
"You know, Daniel, for a man who prides himself on his skills of observation, you seem to miss the obvious when it comes to golf."
Dan tilted his head and asked the question that he knew would lead to more hazing.
Oh, and what's that?
"That your vanity is your downfall,"
Ted said with a mischievous glint in his eye.
"You're so focused on looking good that you forget to relax and enjoy the game."
Dan opened his mouth to protest, but found himself surrendering instead.
You may have a point there, Father. I will try to relax and enjoy being beaten by you again.
Dan stood silent as Ted's ball rolled in a perfect arc across the manicured grass, dropping into the cup with a satisfying ping.
I don't understand how I can lose to a man of the cloth, wielding clubs older than the two of us put together.
Shaking his head. Ted patted him on the shoulder, rolled his eyes toward the heavens, and grinned. They shared another laugh as they moved on to the next hole, the fairway beckoning them forward. As they approached the 8th, a teenage boy, Sammy, his face flushed from running, came up to Dan and Father Ted. He held out 2 folded pieces of paper to Dan, who smiled and pushed a quarter into the boy's palm. Thanks, Sammy. He winked at the boy. Sammy grinned, pocketing the coin before dashing off across the fairway. Dan unfolded the messages and read. The priest was curious about the notes.
What's the news, my friend?
There's been a break-in at the hardware store, and we're getting a visit from Mike Fiorante.
Ted was concerned.
A break-in? Shouldn't we head back then?
Dan shook his head.
No, we'll finish the first 9. It'll take us back to the clubhouse.
Ted chuckled, his eyes alight with mirth.
Do you expect your luck to change, detective?
Not bloody. Not likely. But I'm not about to let a little thing like a break-in ruin my game. After all, I have you for that.
The priest smiled broadly, his white teeth gleaming.
Very well then. Onward to victory.
He pointed to the next tee with his putter as if he were a drum major at the head of a marching band. He moved to the next hole, his ancient clubs rattling at his side. With a sigh, Dan turned his attention back to the game, determined to salvage what was left of his pride on the next green. The break-in and the meeting with Mike would happen soon enough. For now, there was golf to be played and a priest to beat. As slim as that chance was. "25 minutes later, Dan was driving down Redstone's Main Street. The street was lined with an eclectic array of buildings, each telling its part of the town's history. Weathered wooden storefronts stood shoulder to shoulder with newer brick structures, their facades adorned with hand-painted signs and colorful awnings. The sidewalks on the east side of the street, still damp from the morning dew, shined in the sun as they stretched out before the various shops and businesses. In the middle of Main Street, the old clock tower loomed, its face freshly painted and hands ticking steadily, marking the passage of time for the townspeople below. The post office, with its proud American flag fluttering in the gentle breeze, sat across from the town hall, where a few clerks could be seen through the windows, preparing for the day ahead. As one traveled down Main Street, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery hung in the air, mingling with the salty aroma carried in from the nearby ocean. The bookshop's window featured the Cardinal, with a hand-drawn sign proclaiming it #1 bestseller. Dan brought his car to a halt in front of Bishop's Hardware, the familiar shop that was his next stop. He stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket and blinking at the mid-morning sun. Detective Chico Ramirez approached, his polished shoes clicking on the sidewalk. He cut a handsome figure with his slight build, dark eyes, and broad smile, topped by a thin, delicately groomed mustache. He looked picture-perfect, from the crisp lines of his gray-striped suit to the rakish tilt of his black fedora. A matching tie, adorned with a dazzling gold tie stud, completed his look. The young detective exuded an air of confidence and professionalism that masked his years.
"Morning, Detective Kelly,"
said Chico, sounding a little eager. He nodded respectfully to his senior colleague, signaling he was ready to tackle whatever the day might bring.
"What have we got, Chico?"
"It's Chuck, sir. I prefer Chuck,"
said the young detective, flashing a smile. Dan ceded to the young detective's preference.
"All right, Chuck. Fill me in."
As they walked along the side of the store, Chico rattled off the details.
"Perp jimmied the back door sometime last night. Made off with 2 rifles and ammo. Also took 2 kid bikes."
Dan frowned. It was an odd combination of stolen goods.
"Any witnesses?"
"Nothing so far. Mr. Bishop discovered it when he arrived this morning."
They rounded the rear corner of the building. The back door hung ajar, its frame splintered where the lock had been forced. Clarence Bishop stood nearby, his thin and wizened face drawn with worry lines. He appeared tired as Dan and Chico approached.
Mornin', Mr. Bishop. Mind walking us through what you found?
Bishop sighed, rubbing his hand across his mouth. His bony fingers trembled slightly as they moved across his face.
Not much to tell, Dan. Came in at my usual time and found the place like this. They went straight for the gun case, ignored the register completely. Not that there was much in it.
What kind of rifles were they?
Model 70. Winchesters.
Caliber?
.30-06.
Bishop said, showing concern.
Anything distinguishing about them? Any unique marks or features?
Not really. Could find 50 just like 'em in town.
Chuck said there were 2 bikes taken. Where were they?
The 2 that were taken were in the back room.
Gesturing toward the open door.
Had 'em on layaway for Tom Johnson's kids. He was coming to pick 'em up next week.
Dan accepted the information, his mind already working through the possibilities. He turned to Chico, who was scribbling notes on a small pad.
All right, Chuck. Let's take a look inside.
As Dan and Chico entered Bishop's hardware, they were enveloped by the comforting scent of sawdust, metal, and leather that permeated the air. Sunlight streamed through the dusty front windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. The store's interior was an integral part of its long history in Redstone, with shelves reaching from floor to ceiling, packed tightly with a jumbled array of tools, household items, and hardware. Basketballs to bug killers, wagons to water hoses. The atmosphere was one of orderly disorder, with every nook and cranny filled with merchandise. Old-fashioned brass scales, used to purchase nails by the pound, sat atop the counter, while an ancient cash register stood sentinel nearby, its keys worn smooth from decades of use. Faded posters advertising out-of-date products adorned the walls, their edges curling with age. In the corner, a pot-bellied stove stood cold and silent, a reminder of earlier days when it had served as the store's heat source. Motes of dust, stirred by the detective's movements, danced in the shafts of sunlight, adding to the surreal feel of the scene. The break-in had left an invisible scar on the store's welcoming ambiance, transforming the comfortable space into something off-kilter, as if the walls were holding their breath. Detectives Kelly and Ramirez made their way to the back room, where the gun case stood, its glass shattered, items conspicuously missing, and a hammer lying on the floor.
Pop?
Chico said.
What are you doing here?
George Ramirez emerged from behind a stack of paint cans, his face split by a wide grin. He had switched hats from editorial writer to reporter.
Chico, my son. Or should I say, Detective Ramirez.
Chico shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Dan.
It's Chuck, Pop. At work, I go by Chuck.
George waved a hand dismissively.
Chuck, Chico, whatever you like. I'm just here to get the scoop on this break-in. It's big news for Redstone, you know.
He winked at his son to tease him. Dan watched the exchange with both amusement and sympathy. He knew how much Chico looked up to his father, but also how much he wanted to establish himself as his own person, as a detective. George, seemingly oblivious to his son's discomfort, turned to the store owner.
Mr. Bishop, mind if I ask you a few questions?
As George led Bishop away, Dan turned to Chico.
Let's have a look at that gun case.
They examined the shattered glass, noting the jagged edges and the small drops of blood on the floor.
Looks like our thief cut himself. Probably amateurs.
Chico concurred as he jotted down notes.
And they didn't even touch the register.
Exactly. Feels like kids to me.
Chico looked up, unconvinced.
Kids? What would kids want with guns?
Dan shrugged.
The guns are potentially a more serious thing. But those bikes should be easy to find, if they are in town. See if you can get some pictures of them. Maybe from a catalog? Start asking around.
Chico smiled, his face set with determination.
On it, detective.
Oh, and get the serial numbers of the Winchesters from Mr. Bishop.
Of course.
Dan shifted his thoughts to his upcoming meeting with Mike Fiorante. Mike's note had said they were headed to Los Angeles, and something about that didn't sit right. An uncomfortable itch crawled up his spine as he considered the possibilities. Meetings in Los Angeles usually meant trouble, and Mike Fiorante's involvement only amplified that feeling.